Direi che ci siamo più o meno tutti. Ora buon pomeriggio, scusate per la breve pausa, ma i tempi ce l'hanno imposta. Riprendiamo con la seconda sessione pomeridiana. E il primo relatore della seconda sessione pomeridiana è Nicolas Schroeder. Nicolas Schroeder ha ottenuto il dottorato all'Université Libre de Bruxelles nel 2012 con una tesi scritta sotto la direzione di Jean-Pierre Devroy sul monastero di Stavelot-Malmedy nel periodo compreso tra i secoli alto e pieno medievali, che è poi stata pubblicata come monografia nel 2015. Ha lavorato poi come ricercatore di postdottorato all'Università di Oxford e all'Università di Heidelberg, poi di nuovo all'Université Libre de Bruxelles come chargé de recherche, grazie al Fondo Nazionale della Ricerca Scientifica. Presso la stessa università è adesso assistant professor e si occupa in generale di storia sociale ed economica dell'Occidente medievale, con particolare attenzione al rapporto tra uomo e ambiente naturale. Oggi ci parla di Fiscal Estates, Economic Structures and Logics in the Middle Meuse, Basin, I don't know the pronunciation, Basin, 9th-11th centuries, e gli cedo con molto piacere la parola.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Lorenzo, and also for the invitation. And of course, thank you to Tiziana as well. I would like to start by saying that this paper is a paper that emerged out of well, your request, Lorenzo, to say something about fiscal estates, but also work that I've been doing with my students and my colleague Arnaud Knappen over the last 2 years in a seminar. And this seminar was about two fiscal estates. And so to a large extent, what I'm going to say is also based on their comments and remarks. And so I wanted to thank them today for that. Now, the Middle Meuse Basin, which I'm going to talk about today, is basically the kind of the southern part of contemporary Belgium and parts on the border of Germany and the Netherlands, to give you an idea of where that is nowadays. Now, this was undoubtedly one of the most central regions of the Frankish Empire. From very early on, the Pipinid family of Austrasian mayors of the palace had major property in the region of Liège, for example, Herstal and Jupy. And of course, as you all know, Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, was the sedes prima Frantiae between 806 and 822. So that's the region we're talking about. Now, these cores of Carolingian power, so Herstal, Jupy, Aachen, were not isolated. Numerous fiscal estates and other places of royal power were established in the surrounding regions, such as the Ardennes, the area north of the river Vesdre and west of the Meuse. This is what you can see on this older map. It's from 1953 by Guido Rothhoff. And it's basically what I'm going to talk about mainly is what you can see in this red circle. That's the area around Aachen, and you can see all those dots are fiscal estates. So it's a lot of fiscal estates, of course, in that area. And these estates were a real logistical backbone of the Carolingian Empire and of Carolingian policy. Now, the aim of my paper is to characterize the economic organization of these estates and to try to follow them over time through the politically confused late 9th, 10th, and early 11th century. This paper follows a simple chronological structure that you can see here, and it's to a large extent defined by the political history of the Frankish, Ottonian, and Salian realms. I will consider in each of these parts political aspects first, and then look at economic organization. Now, as pointed out in the introduction, the Middle Meuse Basin was undoubtedly one of the most central regions of the Frankish Empire under Charlemagne and Louis the Pious. Estates such as Jupy or Herstal, which are located in the Meuse Valley, they are up here in this area here. I hope you can see that, so close to Liège. They were located around what was slowly emerging at that moment as the episcopal city of Liège in the 9th and 10th century. They were, Jupy, Herstal, long-standing Pépinid family property. They were particularly important before the ascent of Aachen in the last decade of the 8th century. Aachen's palace complex acted as the sedis prima Franciae between 806 mainly and 822. These were very central places of power, of course, where assemblies were held and the Carolingian court stayed for longer periods of time, especially Aachen, of course, which is right here, if you didn't spot it yet. Now, beyond those very iconic places, there is also a large amount of less famous estates that you can see on this map. Their number is substantial in the Ardennes and north of the river Vesdre, as you can see. Now, these estates, the smaller ones, are not documented as well as the more important places that I mentioned before, but they could house the emperor on occasion and course. It's court, for example, for hunting trips, and this type of imperial presence is, for example, attested in Theux, that you can see here, or Longuier, which you can see down here. Recent research into history, archaeology, and historical geography of these places provides us with important information about their economic functions and organization. The Willis capitulary indicates that fiscal estates generally combined two functions. They could host the emperor and its court when they were traveling, and they could also send surplus production to the more important central places where the sovereign stayed for longer periods of time, example here being Aachen, of course. And in this slide, it's very interesting to observe that in the region discussed here, fiscal estates were located on strategic communication nodes. Earlier research had essentially emphasized the reliance on the old Roman road system. But the research that we have carried out with my students shows that Carolingian road networks between the river Meuse and Aachen were largely structured by the specific logic of the Frankish logistical needs. And that's what this map tries to illustrate with a couple of examples. The royal estate of Visé and the hill fort of Chèvremont were both located on crucial sites where the otherwise too steep eastern ridge of the Meuse Valley could be crossed by ox carts that would come from the estates of the Liège area and going towards Aachen and the Rhine Valley. Now, this sounds a bit complicated when I say it like that, but basically what I'm trying to say is that this estate here, that's Visé, and these estates here, Chèvremont and Jupy, were actually central if you want to go from the Meuse Valley towards Aachen. Why is that? Because basically this entire thing that you see here is a relatively steep ridge. You don't see it on this map, but if you go underground and look, this is what we're talking about. Basically, if you want to cross that with ox cart, it's absolutely impossible. When you're standing in front of it, it looks like that nowadays, so you can see why going through that with ox carts doesn't work. So going back to this, basically, this estate were there so that you could then reach Aachen going through flatter terrain. And then, of course, estates such as Herve or Fouron-le-Comte were nodes located ideally on this itinerary, either for geographical reasons. So Herve, for example, is on the hilly ridge that leads towards Aachen from the south. We're talking about this estate. As you can see, it's on this ridge that, of course, allows easy transport. It's really flat once you are up there. Or for historical reasons, going to Fouron. So that's when you go through the north. As I said, Visé is the first place where it's a bit flatter, so you can reach this area here. And then when you go through Fouron-le-Comte up here, you finally reach a Roman road that connects Maastricht to Aachen. Now, this network and logistical infrastructure clearly connected Aachen to the Meuse River, which was a communication route on its own, of course, from north to south for commerce, but also region of craftsmanship, as illustrated by excavation at Huy and Namur, for example. Now, my second example is in a recent published paper, Jean-Louis Cuper has reconstructed part of the road system between the estates Wallorn and Balen, south of Aachen. This is the area down here. So that's Balen, that's Wallorn. And of course, Aix-la-Chapelle, Aachen didn't move. It's still there. Going further. As we can see, this was a relatively dense road network. It made it possible for the king to go to these places, but also to transport agrarian or other produce from these estates towards Aachen. And in this respect, there is particularly interesting recent research that indicates that red marble that is quarried in Balen, and you can see two examples of that type of red marble. So it comes from this area here. This red marble was used in the construction of the Imperial Palace of Aachen, but also Hildesheim, which of course shows that the important fiscal properties in the region discussed here were focused on sustaining the imperial court, be it in Aachen or elsewhere. They could offer shelter when needed, but also produce agrarian surplus, or as we see here, raw materials that could then be sent to the crucial places of power, such as Herstal and later Aachen. A common historiographic theme, initially formulated by William James Thompson in 1935, suggests that as Louis the Pious faced political difficulties in the third decade of the 9th century, this fiscal network, if you will, of estates basically fell apart. And very recently, it has been argued that after 822, and this is a quote, return of perambulatory kingship and polycentric lordship was initiated at that moment, and Aachen was downgraded to the status of a simple border town of the Carolingian Middle Kingdom. Now, I partly disagree with this statement, and I would, at least as far as the topics discussed in this study are concerned, stress more continuity. Now, of course, Louis the Pious became more mobile in the second half of his reign, but Aachen remained a crucial center in his itinerary. The establishment of Francia Media in the Verdun Treaty led to anything but the dissolution of the fiscal network around Aachen. It was actually maintained under the command of a single ruler, that is Lothar I. One could argue that in economic terms, Lothar did in fact rely much more on these estates than Charlemagne or Louis the Pious, who disposed of many more fiscal resources in several regions. Beyond Aachen, Lothar stayed in the royal estates of Theux, Longlier, and Tommen. I can see, so Theux being here, Longlier and Tommen is over there. His son, Lothar II, spent significant time in Aachen. They both stayed at Chèvremont-Hillefort, I showed that already, and I would therefore suggest that the centrality of Aachen and the fiscal network that surrounded it was not really challenged until the Meuse Treaty. Now, fundamental change then can be observed after Lothar's demise in 869. The Meuse Treaty, established in 870 between Louis the German and Charles the Bold, split up the territory initially acquired by their older brother, following this border that you see here in this sort of purple weird color on the screen. The border, as you can see, cuts straight through the region discussed here, following the river Meuse up from Maastricht to the eastern spring of the river Ourthe. This division had significant consequences. As you can see, Aachen became just one ruling place among others in the polycentric realm of Louis the German. It was rich of tradition, of course, but also located on the western border of the realm of Louis the German. Significantly, some of the estates that used to be part of Aachen's supply network were now part, as you see very well on this map, of Western France. For Charles the Bold and his successors, the royal estates in this region became crucial strongholds along the eastern border of their realm. They invested them in several ways. We know that Charles hunted very regularly in this part of the Ardennes that was under his control. So I'm talking about the area here, of course, in blue with the blue estates. He also produced coins for the first time at the Fiscus Bastonia. It's the coin you can see here. It's located there. While we also have coins from Visé from the time of Louis the Stammerer, so his son, of course, and that's the coin you can see here. There are several of these from Visé, which was on the Meuse, but part of the Western Frankish territory. Louis also stayed in several fiscal estates. After having confirmed the Meuse Treaty in Fouron on the 1st of November 878, he spent Christmas in the Palace of Longlier and signed a charter at the Fiscus Orgeau on the 1st of January 879. So Fouron being here, and then he went down to Longlier that you have here and signed a charter in Orgeau. So it's pretty clear that he was actually staying in these estates. Other estates, on the other hand, were transferred to locally active supporters. Louis, for example, granted Antine and Euren-Famenne to his Fidelis Ebroinos in April of the same year. It's the two estates that are here, very much on the border, as you can see. Now, these two parts of Lotharingia were reunited under the authority of Louis the Younger, king of Eastern Francia, through the Treaty of Ribemont, that's in 880. Shortly thereafter, new challenges emerged for the places we are discussing. In November and December 881, a group of Vikings raided Maastricht, Aachen, Liège, Jülich, Zulich, and the monasteries of Cornelimünster, Stavelot, and Malmedy. It's all very much in the region we're discussing here. And this certainly led to economic destabilization, and we can see a first significant phase of transfer of fiscal estates to the church at that moment. Charles the Fat took over Lotharingia when Louis the Younger died in 882. He granted Blaindeff to Stavelot-Malmedy in 882, so the exact same year. That's the estate that you can see here in yellow, and that's the monastery of Stavelot. As well as Bastogne with its market, and perhaps Konzen to Our Lady in Aachen before 887. Bastogne is here, Konzen is here, and Our Lady in Aachen is, of course, in Aachen. I'm inclined to understand these donations as a way to economically support communities and institutions that were damaged by a Viking raiding at that time. Under Arnulf of Carinthia, who had taken power in 887, another series of Viking attacks took place. In June 891, a group passed the Meuse River not far away from Liège and ambushed logistical convoys in the swamps and woods around Aachen. Arnulf defeated them in August, but in February 892, a new group was active in the region between the rivers Meuse and Rhine. In 895, Lotharingia was made a kingdom again under the rule of Arnulf's son, Zwentibold his name. Now, quite logically, for 5 years, there was a new interest in the fiscal estates of the region. Zwentibold, the new king of Lotharingia, stayed in Amberlou on November 11th, 896, and in Palissol on January 28th of the next year. Amberlou is around here, Palissol a bit further to the south, right here. However, there were also major donations to ecclesiastical institutions who had helped defend the region against Viking raiding in the previous decades. In 898, the Palace of Theux was given to the Bishop Franco of Liège. Theux is situated here, and Liège, of course, right there. Zwentibold was killed in 900 by Reginald, a major figure of the Lotharingian aristocracy, who operated as a duke in the region. This act opens 40 years of tensions and dissent around royal successions, during which the Lotharingian aristocracy openly defied royal power shifting alliances between Eastern and Western kings. Lotharingia was now a duchy, and during this period, much of the region's royal estates were ducal beneficia in the hands of Regina and his son Giselbert. The Chronicle of Richer, for example, reports that the crucial fiscal estates of Jupy, Herstal, Chèvremont, Meuse were in his hands, while Charles the Simple ruled over Lotharingia as king. That's between 911 and 923. And this was a weird period. It's not to say that all fiscal estates were out of royal control. Charles actually stayed in Aachen and Herstal, for example. But there is clearly a sort of hesitation. Is this ducal property of Giselbert and Regnier, or does it belong to the king directly? It's always a matter of tension at that period, in that period. And beyond that, we do not have much information about the economic uses of fiscal estates during those 40 years. A remark by Richer indicates that many estates were granted out to the followers of the Lotharingian aristocracy by Reginald and Giselbert. They were, above all, at that moment, as far as we can see, part of a gift-giving economy that created fidelities amongst the Lotharingian nobility. But then all of this changed again when the regional power of Giselbert faced the growing influence of the Ottonian family in Lotharingia. Henry the Fowler tried to rein in the autonomous tendency of Giselbert by organizing his marriage with his daughter Gerberga and letting him keep some fiscal property. However, Giselbert continued to assert his own and Lotharingia's autonomy. He finally died while fighting Otto I at the Andernach battle in 939. And this episode initiated a significant reassertion of royal power. The Dukes of Lotharingia were now Ottonian appointees, nothing more. Fiscal estates were taken over by the crown, and the sovereign was again visiting these places. As early as 930, the Ottonians were regularly present in Aachen. Otto I visited Büllingen in 940 and Visé, that I already mentioned, in 941 and 942, for example. Now, as established by Guido Rothoff in 1953, after this sort of initial phase of demonstration of strong Ottonian power, royal authorities were able to keep control of fiscal property in the regions, sometimes until the 12th century. Estates such as Amel, Bütchenbach, Scherin, or Vals apparently remained under direct royal control or imperial control, depending on the moment. However, there are also estates that were willingly alienated by the Ottonian kings or emperors. In 946, Otto I gave property located in the royal estate of Longlier to one Conrad and his wife Leva. Now, this was a very exceptional case as it concerns a lay aristocrat. In fact, most permanent transfers of fiscal property were made to the church by Ottonians. Under Otto I in 972, part of the Hillfort of Chèvremont was given to Our Lady in Aachen. Under Otto II, the Bishop of Liège was granted market rights in Visé. Under Otto III, Our Lady in Aachen was granted rights in both Jupy and Herstal. Under Henry II, rights in Jupy were granted to the Bishop of Verdun. And this resulted in what you can see here. Now, this type of transfer of property to the church follows several logics. Firstly, it did, of course, provide these institutions with economic means to subsist. Secondly, giving land to the church was part of the political strategy of the Ottonian Reichskirche. Giving land and revenues to ecclesiastical actors, such as the bishops of Liège or Verdun, was a way to reduce the influence of the local and regional aristocracy. In the long run, this policy created the conditions for the emergence and/or the reinforcement of large ecclesiastical estates. Indeed, by granting fiscal estates or marketplaces, such as Visé, to ecclesiastical institutions, the Ottonian sovereigns effectively reorganized a network of estates that had been designed first and foremost to sustain the Frankish, royal, and later imperial courts. They fragmented this network, therewith allowing several religious institutions to develop their own logistical networks. And these networks in turn participated in the urban development of the episcopal city of Liège and the town of Aachen during the Central Middle Ages. Importantly, these transfers of fiscal property to the church came with the obligation for bishops and abbots to host the court on occasion and send surplus produce to it. In this light, the new arrangements that were operated might also have been a driver to increase production, as former fiscal estates now had to sustain both their main ecclesiastical lord and, indirectly, the imperial courts. Now, it should be clear by now that until the 11th century, direct permanent donations of fiscal property to lay aristocrats were relatively rare. Of course, some fiscal land and revenues were granted to aristocrats who represented central power in the function of duke or count. We know, for example, that before being given to the Bishop of Liège in 983, the market rights in Visé were under control of Beatrix, Duchess of Higher Lotharingia. Now, a crucial point about this type of control of fiscal land by aristocrats is that it was, at least in theory, appointed, these people were, at least in theory, appointed by the king or emperor. And as a consequence, he had the right to seize and take back that type of land if he was displeased with the service of those people. And that happened relatively frequently, as far as we can judge from chronicles and charters. But then a new major shift occurred under Henry III. As pointed out recently by Jean-Louis Cuper, grave tensions emerged around the succession of Duke Goslow of Higher and Lower Lotharingia, who died in 1044. His son, Godfrey the Bearded, intended to take back control over both Higher and Lower Lotharingia, so the entire former realm of Lotharingia. But the sovereign wanted to reduce his power. And this led, of course, to major conflicts, including the destruction of Verdun and the imperial palace of Nijmegen, as well as the siege of Liège. Eventually, Godfrey renounced his claims in 1049. Of course, during this conflict, Henry doubled down on Reichskirche's strategy. He granted rights and lands to various monastic institutions and to the Bishop of Liège. You have them here. I'm not going to mention them all because I'm running short in time. But there is an important point at that moment. Henry also chose to directly support Frederick, Duke of Lower Lotharingia, an aristocrat who was opposed to Godfrey and more loyal to the imperial cause. And in this context, crucial elements of fiscal property in the region were transferred to Frederick. The estate of Basin, which is located here, and on which a castle, the Limburg, had just been built. The estate of Orto, right here, with a castle, again, the castle of La Roche en Ardennes, and the estates in Amberlou and Sprimont ended up in Frederick's hand. Now, these transfers of fiscal property turn out to be decisive in what happened later in the landscape. In the decade of regency after Henry III's death, and then the investiture controversy under Henry IV, the Lotharingian aristocracy gradually developed a stronger sense of its autonomy and identity. The generation after Frederick developed the county of La Roche around the castle near to Orto, and the county of Limburg around the castle built again on fiscal land. They became, these castles, new centers of power, but also economic hubs, central places on their own that needed to be supported logistically and that attracted surplus production, craftsmanship, and luxury production. In the late 11th and during the 12th century, the political and economic organization of the region decisively shifted away from the inheritance of a fiscal network centered around Aachen. By then, a large part of Carolingian fiscal estates had been absorbed in new economic structures, such as ecclesiastical estates, the episcopal city of Liège, various towns of minor importance, and principalities centered on castles. And this leads me quickly to my conclusion, or should I? Oh, excellent. That's more than I need. Thank you, Lorenzo. Now, with this, we have the main observations that I wanted to make in this paper. The numerous fiscal estates of the region discussed here were part of an economic network that supported the imperial court around the Liège area and Aachen. It effectively connected the political center of the empire, that is Aachen, to the Meuse River, The Meuse River at that time was a commerce and craftsmanship area. It also connected the old Pépinette estates around Liège to Aachen. And it connected numerous smaller rural estates all over the area to Aachen and the Meuse area. Now, I believe that these functions, really geared, if you want, towards imperial power and economy, were maintained until 870, despite the division of the Frankish realm. Then, with the Meuse Treaty in 870, the area under study was politically divided between Eastern and Western Francia for 10 years. Accordingly, for 10 years, these estates were separated in two groups. They remained important for sovereigns from both sides because they were hubs of power on their border and places with a very powerful inheritance in terms of political symbolism. Viking raiding in the late 9th century, followed by the affirmation of powerful aristocrats until circa 940, led to a reduction of royal influence on fiscal estates in the area. Aachen was temporarily occupied by Vikings. Fiscal estates were in the hands of Reginald and his son Gislebert, who basically used them to build powerful clienteles. However, this structural reorganization of fiscal property, sort of, to take your terms, a sort of first feudal moment, if you will, was not maintained. The reassertion of royal power under the Ottonians in that particular region led to a new phase. Estates came back under royal control. And within the framework of the Reichskirche, some of them were granted to very powerful ecclesiastical lords, such as the Bishop of Liège or the canons of Our Lady in Aachen. And this was a sort of first step in the long-term redefinition of the economic logic of and political logic of fiscal estates. They were increasingly part of the religious Grundherrschaft economy of the region. And this, in turn, played a major role in urban development. And then a second phase, or a third phase, depending on how you value the 40-year parentheses of the first feudal moment, if you will. And this was under Henry III. As he was engaged in his conflict with Godfrey the Bearded, Henry transferred further possessions to the Reichskirche, but also to Frederick of Lower Lotharingia, which he trusted at that moment. These estates and the castles they were associated with were then central in the construction of a new political and economic landscape of principalities. And this is sort of unintended consequences, of course. You have to imagine that he didn't expect to have 10 years of regency and then, of course, the investiture controversy. And this dynamic was basically created or reinforced largely by the regency of Henry IV and the turmoil of the investiture controversy. That's what I'm trying to say. And of course, during this period, aristocratic, not academic, aristocratic independence was reinforced. And that's centrally the problem here, at least if you look at it from a fiscal perspective. Around castles, a new network of towns and markets then emerged. And a fascinating aspect of these dynamics is that Carolingian fiscal estates were somehow repurposed, if you will, and used as building blocks within different economic and political organizations that were actually to last well into the 12th and 13th centuries. That's all I had to say. Basta così e grazie per l'attenzione.